Hey everyone, it's Samuel,
And I'm Zach.
and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons and Dragons.
Today in the Prime Material, it's Barbarian Day.
In the wilds, the barbarous minotaur.
And in the tavern, what would you do if you encountered a roving band of barbarians?
All right, let's go. Well, thanks for joining me again, Zach.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, excited to talk about barbarians and one of your characters, in fact, your first character, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, my first character in D&D was a barbarian.
Yeah, excited to talk a little bit about that amazing and fun class. Before we get into it, just a couple announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram. Subscribe to us on YouTube if that would be your favorite way of listening to the podcast. And of course, let me take this time to say thanks to all our Plot Hooks family for helping us reach the goal of 250 followers on Twitter. The contest for the D&D sourcebook closed this past week, and we want to thank you all for entering. And we're just so excited for the Plot Hooks family to keep growing, and we are excited to keep hitting more milestones. Finally, it'd be awesome of you to support us on Patreon. Lots of awesome perks are up there for our patrons, including our homebrew world of Carrick that we keep releasing information on. About a week and a half ago, we released the creation myth for our patrons, in addition to the list of Carrick and magic items that's already up there, as well as the description of what sets Carrick apart from other D&D settings, which is publicly available on our Patreon. Later this week, or perhaps towards the end of the week, depending on exactly when I'm able to finish it, we're going to be doing another release, actually a release of the full pantheon of the gods which are there in Carrick. But your support would be very much appreciated. It helps us make this podcast even better for you. All right, with that out of the way, barbarians. That's one of the most iconic classes, isn't it, in Dungeons and Dragons? It's even so much more so since the rise of Critical Role and Travis Willingham's lovable Goliath barbarian, Grog Strongjaw. You know, the rage, the ability to soak up damage while you're just frothing at the mouth, wildly swinging your weapon at everything that moves. It's a fun concept, and it's something that's so far removed from our normal experience that it's something that we really enjoy to play. And of course, it was your first choice for your first ever character.
Yeah, so many years ago, Mike, another member of the podcast, had approached me about playing D&D and joining his game. That's actually where I met you, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
I knew of D&D, never played before, didn't know a lot of like how to play per se. And so I was like, I want something like simple, like easy class to learn. And Mike was like, hey man, play a barbarian. All you gotta do is get angry and smash. And I'm like, I can do that. that's simple. I can do that.
Yeah.
Thus, Grognak was born.
Yeah. Kind of odd in how you played a barbarian named Grognak, and then of course a barbarian named Grog became one of the more famous characters in D&D history. But believe it or not, Grognak actually predated the release of Critical Role.
Hey, I mean, Grog could just be short for Grognak. We don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Similar characters in the fact that you had a similar, how to put this nicely, unintelligent brute of a barbarian, in your case a half-orc, which just loved to just rage and smash.
Also, I guess ironic in the sense that both characters also enjoyed heavily drinking.
Yeah.
So a lot of similarities there, funnily enough.
Well, that is the very stereotypical barbarian trope, that and much like the rogue, which we discussed 2 weeks ago with Shannon from Advantage in Paradise, the barbarian is a class which kind of appeals to us because it's again so far removed from our normal human experience, and it's fascinating to put ourselves in the shoes of this kind of brutish character. And the trope is that you aren't that intelligent, that you're just kind of a feral creature almost in some respects, and that's great. Well, we could tell fascinating stories with that. It is something which is really interesting to craft narratives with your friends around. But today we want to ask the question: can we make a smart barbarian, or perhaps not necessarily a above average intelligence barbarian, but just is it possible to have a barbarian that doesn't fall into that trope of being unintelligent and brutish? And to answer that question, we're going to look into the player's handbook and other supplementary materials and see what it has to say about the class. And I think what we'll discover is that really the fact that we think that we can't make an intelligent barbarian is based a little bit on some misconceptions that we have regarding the class. And we want to kind of dispel some of those today. So, first, let's just read a little bit out of the player's handbook on page 46 and see what it has to say about the class.
People of towns and cities take pride in how their civilized ways set them apart from animals, as if denying one's own nature was a mark of superiority. To a barbarian, though, civilization is no virtue, but a sign of weakness. The strong embrace their animal nature, keen instincts, primal physicality, and ferocious rage. Barbarians are uncomfortable when hedged in by walls and crowds. They thrive in the wilds of their homelands, the tundra, jungle, or grasslands where their tribes live and hunt. Barbarians come alive in the chaos of combat. They can enter a berserk state where rage takes over, giving them superhuman strength and resilience. A barbarian can draw on this reservoir of fury only a few times without resting, but those few rages are usually sufficient to defeat whatever threats arise. Not
Oh.
every member of these tribes, deemed barbarians by scions of civilized society, has the barbarian class. A true barbarian among these people is as uncommon as a skilled fighter in a town, and or she plays a similar role as a protector of the people and a leader in times of war. Life in the wild places of the world is fraught with peril, rival tribes, deadly weather, and terrifying monsters. Barbarians charge headlong into that danger so that their people don't have to. Their courage in the face of danger makes barbarians perfectly suited for adventuring. Wandering is often a way of life for their native tribes, and the rootless life of the adventurer is a little hardship for the barbarian. Some barbarians miss the close-knit family structures of the tribe, but eventually find them replaced by the bonds formed among the members of their adventuring parties.
So, in reading this extended portion, again, straight out of the player's handbook, there's really nothing in this description which says their intelligence or wisdom has to be low. There's no requirement for them to be dumb. Uncivilized? Yes. Primal? Yes. Ferocious? Yes. But not inherently unintelligent. So why is it that we think that they are? Whenever we think of barbarians, why do we think of immediately an unintelligent brute? And again, if you desire to tell a story about that, absolutely go for it. That's amazing. We could tell fascinating stories with that type of barbarian. Grognak is an excellent example. There was some fascinating stories that we told together with him and my wizard Sidron, which were some of the best role playing moments that I've had in D&D. But we don't have to limit ourselves to that. And I think it comes down really to three misconceptions. The first one is that uncivilized means unintelligent. Uncivilized means unintelligent. And this, unfortunately, comes a little bit into the real world. It comes a little bit into real world stereotypes where, especially us in the West, in the United States and European cultures, we have a high view of our own civilization, and we look down at people who we would deem as more primitive than our own, and we assume that because their lifestyle might not meet our own standards of what we think civilization should look like, we inherently assume that that means that they're unintelligent. And this goes all the way back in history. It's always been this way. You think one of the prime examples is Julius Caesar in his book where he recorded his conquest of the Gauls, his conquest of all the Gallic tribes in Europe, and he's framing them as these barbarians, but really just because they didn't have the civilization of Rome does not mean that they were inherently unintelligent. And again, I think we have some real world stereotypes when we hear that word barbarian that kind of inherently makes us think unintelligent, inherently makes us think of stereotypes of tribal civilizations which shun outsiders and are just complete unintelligent brutes with no language whatsoever, and none of that is true. That's just a misconception which we have, which is based on our own real world stereotypes.
And so that kind of leads us to our second misconception, I think, which is rage means being ruled by your emotions. The fact that the barbarian chooses whether or not to enter a rage is key here. They don't just rush in and become furious at all opportunities. They have to use it intelligently and channel it at specific times to try and accomplish certain tasks or to defend people. And that's kind of like the opposite of being ruled by your emotions. You have to be more in control, I think,
Hmm.
to not just fly off the handle every opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, you only get a certain number of rages. Absolutely. This actually is based off of a post that I saw in my research by a Quora user named Demetrius Smith. And I think it's exactly right. You know, you choose whether or not to enter rage. If you want to go through in combat without raging, that's perfectly fine, right? You can go through minor combats without wasting your rage. You can tank without wasting your rage. You don't have to be a character that just immediately flies off the handle. That's not what rage means. Of course, we love the first instance of a combat, using those words, I would like to rage. That's awesome. That's fun. And oftentimes you do have to do that in combat because a combat is going to be dangerous. But you're choosing to do that. You're not being ruled by the emotions. You're not seeing a threat. You're not seeing a person and immediately deciding to just fly off the handle. It is a choice that you make. You are choosing to allow the rage to take over and froth at the mouth and flail around and take all the damage and try to kill all the enemies. That is your choice. And like you said, that's kind of the opposite of being ruled by your emotions. So we have the misconception that uncivilized means unintelligent, the misconception that rage means being fueled by your emotions. There's also the misconception that the subclasses all play up the barbarianism. And I think that's because the main subclass we think of when we think of the barbarian, which is the one which I think you played and Grog played, is the primal path of the berserker. And that certainly does play more into that space. You've got features like your frenzied rage. You've got features like your mindless rage, which you get at 6th level. Your intimidating presence, and that certainly does play more into that stereotypical barbarian. But really, if you look at the other subclasses don't necessarily play into that space. And just looking at the ones which we find in the player's handbook and Xanathar's Guide to Everything, you see the other one in the player's handbook, the Path of the Totem Warrior. The player's handbook flat out states that it's a spiritual journey. You're accepting a spirit animal and gaining attunement with the nature around you via that spiritual connection. You can even cast spells. You get beast sense and speak with animals at level 3, and you can commune with nature at level 10 through the spirit animal totem that you've chosen. It's not a journey for the unintelligent. If you have an intelligent of 4, your connection with a spiritual journey is going to be a little bit limited, I would think.
Yeah, I would say you have to be at least reasonably intelligent to be on a spiritual journey such as that.
Hmm.
So our second one is the Path of the Ancestral Guardian. And this is a barbarian that has a deep connection with his ancestors.
Mm.
They get their power from their in their rage by calling on the spirits of their ancestors to help them, and that respect and reverence that a barbarian would have for his ancestral spirits is hardly that of an unintelligent brute. And in this class, you start getting spells at 10th level, such
Hmm.
as clairvoyance. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that an unintelligent barbarian can't cast spells, but
Yes, you're
um,
correct. I think once you
um,
reach a certain point, you can't cast
you,
spells.
yeah,
The
but
feeble mind spell, of course, makes you to where you can't cast spells, but it puts your intelligence to 1.
I think this is like again with the totem war. This is another path that shows that you can play a barbarian who's still intelligent because of how they use it and where they get it from.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And you can, of course, still do a brute, as you mentioned. You could still cast augury and clairvoyance. You could still cast, the spells of the other classes that we're going to mention and already have mentioned. Even if you are someone who's more of that unintelligent stereotype, it's just that it doesn't have to be that way. It's something where we artificially limit ourselves almost. The third path is the path of the Storm Herald. And these barbarians have actually learned to produce a magical aura whenever they rage. And that aura varies based off of whatever environment their aura is from. But they get to actually produce this magical energy field around them as they rage, which has various effects on the enemies around them and their environment. That's something which you certainly can play up as just something that's inherent, something that they just get because they're so connected with the environment perhaps that they're from, or you can certainly play that up. But it's also something that you could play up that they have learned how to produce this whenever they rage. They've learned how to control their rage and channel this magical essence and produce it only whenever they want to. And again, that's something which, is not necessarily just a path of an unintelligent personality. That's something that a very intelligent person can do.
so our fourth one is going to be the Path of the Zealot, and this path is where a barbarian is channeling divine power with their rage. They're serving a deity with their acts of war prowess. Again, with this, you could play an unintelligent brute if that's what you want. It would still work fine, but if you're playing one that has more intelligence, they're not just I'm serving this deity so I can get this extra power in my rage. No, they're doing it because they want to. They're like, I'm gonna serve, like
Hmm.
I can serve this deity and spread word of like their gospel or what have you. And because I do the service for this deity, the deity in return gives me this power to help
Hmm.
augment myself. And
Absolutely.
again, it's one of those like you can play either way, whatever floats your boat.
Yeah, absolutely.
They
No,
both
yeah,
work.
we say all the time on this podcast that we're not trying to create hard and fast rules for our role playing. The beauty of role playing is its flexibility. The whole point of this episode is to make sure that we don't limit ourselves artificially. And ultimately, I think we do that sometimes. I think The reason we often don't come up with barbarians which are smarter is not due to a lack of play space that's built into the class. I think that play space is there. I think the reason we don't come up with those type of barbarians is these misconceptions getting in our way and falsely limiting our play space. And there's really interesting space there with the barbarian. And you can even see things like even going back to Critical Role and the differences between Grog and the second campaign's barbarian Yasha. Very different characters. Yasha is not an unintelligent person. She is a member of the Path of the Zealot, serving the Stormlord. And we think we have to come up with a reason for our barbarian to be smart. But in reality, I think we just have to confront some of these misconceptions about the class.
And Xanathar's Guide to Everything almost actively encourages this. It can be tempting to play a barbarian character that is a straightforward application of the classic archetype, a brute, and usually a dim one at that, who rushes in where others fear to tread. But not all barbarians are cut from the same cloth, so you can certainly put your own spin on things. And that's just, what we're trying to encourage here.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to play a dumb barbarian, by all means, go
Yes.
for it. Like, I am all for that. I have done it myself, and it's a lot of
Yep.
fun.
It is fun.
Grognak is. I've played many characters, and Grognak, is still one of my favorite characters I've ever gotten to play.
Mm-hmm.
We're just trying to encourage you not to limit yourself. There's nothing wrong with breaking the mold and trying to play a more intelligent barbarian. We encourage that.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly can add a lot to the class if you've never actually done that before.
I hope to one day get to play a barbarian again, and I actually do want to play a smarter barbarian and see how different the role playing is. As someone who has played a less intelligent barbarian, I'd like to play a smart one and be able to like contrast the two, still play the same class, but play them in vastly different ways.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about before your desire to play a barbarian who's actually afraid of raging, because they've seen
Yep.
the damage that they can do. Not that they don't actually rage, but they're nervous about it. They don't like it, almost like a lycanthropic character being afraid of their transformation because they're afraid of losing control. And that's, the thought process of an intelligent being trying to figure out where the rage fits in with their personality and their humanity or whatever race you happen to be. And that's not a pursuit of a dumb character.
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe his intelligence is why he's afraid to
Mm,
do it. He can actually see and comprehend more of his actions. So
yeah.
whereas much as I loved Grognak, he's like, hey, enemies, cool, I'm gonna kill him. Had no care for anything past that. Um
Me think
so
no moves ahead.
listen, Grognak is not a good chess player.
Yeah.
No moves ahead.
No. Well, I think that'll just about do it for this week's Prime Material. What do you say we head over to the wilds and look at some brutish minotaurs?
Yeah, let's head out.
All right, we're out here in the wilds, and this is quite a maze we have here.
Yeah, I think we might take a wrong turn.
Yeah,
Is there a local we can ask for some directions?
well, I'm honestly not really desiring to speak to the locals because I'm afraid the locals might be minotaurs.
Yeah, maybe not
um,
the best idea.
yeah, well, might should avoid them. And we did choose the minotaur for the wilds today because they're sort of like the monstrous equivalent of the barbarian. The way they're described in the monster manual on page 223, I envision them fighting like a barbarian in a rage. They even have the same reckless attack feature that barbarians have. Of course, minotaurs originally come from Greek mythology, and in that original legend, which we won't get into, it's pretty messed up, but it's not actually a race of creatures. It was just the minotaur. And in Greek lore, a giant labyrinth was created for the minotaur to live in. And throughout history, as various stories of minotaurs have been crafted, they're often associated with this idea of labyrinths and mazes. And that very much so holds true in Dungeons and Dragons. In D&D, minotaurs are created by Baphomet, which is a demon lord known as the Horned King, who resembles a beastly minotaur and actually rules a layer of the abyss called the Endless Maze. And minotaurs are created in vile rituals of cults of the Horned King, though only the highest ranking members of the cults actually know that Baphomet is behind the cult. Instead, the cults masquerade as a movement that's just rejecting authority and civilization as oppressive constructs. Reminds me a lot of the Gruul if you play Magic the Gathering, or if you've interacted with the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica in a Dungeons and Dragons setting. They're just kind of this group which rejects authority, and inductees will put on what looks like a ceremonial animal mask, and they'll enter a labyrinth where they just kind of engage in primacy and in savagery, first by killing and feasting on beasts, and finally there's humanoid sacrifices. And if the inductee persists through all of this and does not turn once they've learned of the cult secret, they're blessed with the, well, I guess blessed in air quotes, with the vile form of the minotaur. But once they are created, they're pretty interesting creatures to use in stories.
Funny though that we're talking about Grognak today in this episode in the Minotaur, because actually in the campaign that you and I were in, that where I had to play Grognak, there was one scene where during a fight we were in, a Minotaur appeared, and Grognak basically had to like 1v1 fight a Minotaur, and it at the end it ended up turning into just a battle of wills, in the sense that they just started like rage screaming at each other until the Minotaur finally gave in, and Grognak's like, cool, I have a sidekick now, this is great. And that's just one example you can do with a Minotaur. It doesn't have to just be like, hey, here's a bull man in a maze, go kill him. And our DM actually allowed me to role play that scene out, and it worked to my advantage.
Yeah, they can be really interesting to use if you can talk them down or bargain with it or charm it in some way, or intimidate it. And that would be very difficult to do, as it was for you, because I mean the Monster Manual even states that they are very difficult to control. They still buck against civilization and control, and they don't respect authority at all. But if you can figure out a way to do it, then it can actually be a really interesting creature to drop in a dungeon or in a place where your party is trying to figure out where to go, because they do have a feature called Labyrinthian Recall. They can perfectly recall any path that it's traveled. And one of the interesting facts about the encounter that you're referencing actually is the Minotaur was actually magically transported there. We were in a setting where almost like the planes were breaking down, and he couldn't exactly recall how he had gotten there because he had just magically been transported. But if you use this in a dungeon, in a maze, in a labyrinth, then if you can bargain with it or charm it, then he can actually become an ally to help the party in terms of telling them how to get through this dungeon. And so you can just drop a Minotaur as a DM into an encounter, and if your players just want to kill it and move on, sure. But they also have the option of trying to talk it down or charming it, and using the information that it has to actually get through the dungeon in a different manner than just roaming through, killing everything you find. They are, of course, though, still creatures that you can use just in terms of a combat encounter. They are very feral, and if the scent of blood or hearing flesh or bones being torn open and sundered, it can really spur them into a blood rage, almost like a blood frenzy of a shark. And they will just go around goring everything and just trying to destroy everything in their path, just with their primal savage nature. And so they can be used absolutely in that way. Another interesting way of using them, I think, is I would love to see a circumstance where a dungeon that a party is going through is actually one of these labyrinths where one of these cults of Baphomet are actually located. You actually come across these inductees engaging in these very primal acts. So you're encountering cultists, you're encountering these people that are just savagely trying to kill you. You encounter minotaurs that have been formed. And I think it would make for a very interesting and creepy horror style dungeon, because you're just coming across all this grotesque, vile rituals and circumstances. The monster manual even states that the labyrinths where these things occur become blood-soaked halls of slaughter, which sounds like a great horror campaign trope. um,
Absolutely.
and so I think you could use them in that manner. There's even a stat block under the skeleton section of the monster manual on page 273 for a minotaur skeleton, which you could incorporate that in some way as well.
Being in a endless maze full of bloodstains and cults is sounds like a fun time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a perfect Saturday.
Or
Well, I think that just about does it for the Minotaurs. I'm a little creeped out by this labyrinth. Why don't we head back to the tavern and grab some refreshment?
I am down. These hallways are a little gross.
Whew, finally out of that disgusting maze.
Glad to be back at the tavern. That tour guide was a little creepy.
What's the plot hook that we're going to be talking about today?
What would you do if you came across a roving band of barbarians?
Oh, great. More barbarians. Now, this is actually a really cool thing to add to your random encounter table if your party is traveling through the wilderness in your setting. It's your random encounters can't always be bandits or beast attacks, and coming across a traveling band of barbarians can actually be a pretty interesting encounter. As we were going through in the first section, reading the introduction to the barbarian class out of the player's handbook, it even mentions the fact that they can be nomadic. And so it's very feasible for a party to just come across some. And you can come across them in a variety of ways. You can come across them at night. You can come across a camp. You can come across them on a path that you perhaps frequently travel, and now they've just moved in. Perhaps you come across them on a main road and they're camping on it now, and they're trying to charge tolls and make some easy coin by just trying to ambush people across this path. Perhaps you come across it as the barbarians are even fighting someone else. Maybe they're nomadic because they're being driven out of the place where they used to be, and now they're almost fleeing, and any number of these encounters can turn either just combat oriented, or they can be very role play heavy. You can try to sneak past these nomadic tribes. You can just try to bowl them over and destroy them. You can try to talk to them and figure out what's going on, make some interesting charisma rolls in that encounter. And there's lots of different ways that you can use them.
This could also just be a friendly tribe of barbarians
Yeah.
who maybe they're just like, hey, we're travelers. We can sit there and like barter with them. You know,
Mm-hmm.
get supplies. Maybe they don't have need for gold.
Yeah.
And they're just like, yo, we have extra food. So come
Yeah.
sit by the fire. Like, there's different
Absolutely.
ways that this can pan out.
Yeah, if you do want to use them in a combat encounter, I'd recommend looking at page 344 of the Monster Manual because there's a stat block for Berserker, which is a challenge rating 2 and pretty well matches what you would expect for a barbarian. It even has, again, that reckless attack feature, which is so iconic for a barbarian. There's also different leader stat blocks, like the bandit captain stat block, which is actually on the same page, which can actually provide you with a leader for your barbarians if you do decide to take them in a combat direction. I really like that idea of bartering, where you can come across them and they can almost just be like a trade station. Again, they don't have to be brutish. You can come across them and they're just normal, intelligent beings that just happen to eschew the comforts of what we would consider as civilization. And you can come across them and they would have some really interesting items which you're not going to find in a magic shop in a really sophisticated city.
Barbarian Khajiit has wares.
Yes, exactly.
um, if you're playing a barbarian or you have a barbarian as one of your players, perhaps this is their tribe that you come across.
Yeah.
Um, and it could be a friendly reunion for them,
Mm.
or depending on how you are, for example, like with Grok Strongjaw from
Mm-hmm.
Critical Role, when they came across his old tribe, he had gotten kicked out and they had
Mm-hmm.
tried to kill him. And so that turned into a big battle.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on what kind of barbarian you're playing and what their backstory is, you can make this into an even more interesting encounter if
Yeah.
you play into that.
Mm-hmm. You can also use it if you have a barbarian in your party as almost like a proof of metal encounter. You can have, a quote unquote safe combat where you interact with this. Perhaps it is your tribe, as you mentioned, or it is a tribe that's perhaps familiar with your tribe, or what have you, and you come across and perhaps you have almost like a cage match with one of their champions, and you get to actually role play a cool safe encounter where your life's not in danger, but they're untrusting of you, and you have to kind of prove yourself first before you can get to that bartering and conversing. And so you have almost this one-on-one ring fight where you can not be afraid of actual demise for your character.
And that can still go both ways. If you win this bout of respect, you could have gained some powerful allies, but it can be role played as even if your character loses, that could still not necessarily be a bad thing. It's not like if you lose, they're gonna attack you unless that's the way you guys play it out. It could just be of you may have lost, but you lost to our best champion,
Mm-hmm.
and we have still gained respect for you for how well you performed in
Yeah.
this combat. It could still be a fun combat without a risk of death, and no matter how it turns out, it could still be positive for your players. It's all just about how you play it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that might just about wrap up this episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks very much for joining me today, Zach.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much to all of you listening out there from all of us here at Plot Hooks, me, Samuel, Zach, Mike, Matt, Steve, Dave, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.